Hello, everyone. This is Keith Stone with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and I'm delighted to be here with Professor Jeff Rusten from Cornell for another Cosmos Society online open house. I'd like to briefly introduce you, Jeff, before I let you start talking. Professor Rusten is coming to us from Cornell, where he's taught since 1988 in the classics department. He's been chair of the department twice. The director of graduate studies for the theater program also at Cornell. He received his PhD from Harvard, which I identify with. He's taught there at Harvard, as well as at the University of Cologne, as well as at Penn and Washington University in St. Louis. You have quite a long list here that I am going to mostly elide because it's on our website. But most relevantly, you've recently edited, or perhaps you've done actually, the translations in a book called The Birth of Comedy, which is translation of the most important fragments of 2 centuries of ancient Greek comedy, published by Johns Hopkins. And as is my usual custom, I'm going to ask you, could you tell us a bit how you first came to love classics, since it's brought you so far to this point?
Well, actually, Hélène was in some of my first Greek courses, but even before that, I got in by a kind of odd route. I was at Carleton College, and I was looking for something to study, and I became very interested in Japanese literature and translation. I took a course, and I thought, this is wonderful. I want to take it. And at that time, believe it or not, they did not teach Japanese. And unless you went to Japan, and I couldn't go to Japan as a freshman. There was one language that began in the 2nd semester, only one in the entire college, and that was ancient Greek. And I figured, I'll give it a try. I know nothing about it. And the teacher was somebody you may have heard of, David Porter, who was later president of Carleton and president of Skidmore. He died just last year. He was an amazing person. I don't think anybody could have been in his class and not be attracted to classics. I discovered halfway through the semester that he was also a concert pianist, and he had a joint appointment in music, and went to several of his concerts, and then also heard him lecture on Greek literature and translation. And that alone was enough to keep me going. That's not a very informed way to get into it, but I've changed my motivations or altered them and adapted them as I went on. And now there are a lot more reasons why I'm in it. And it was a very fortunate choice. So
thank you.
That's,
thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's always very interesting to know. All right. I'd like to formally turn it over to you to talk about comedy with us today.
Great. Okay. Well, first, thank you very much to Keith and Sarah and Hélène, especially thank you. And what I wanted to do is today I thought I'd kind of go in order through the topics that I mentioned to you, but I think I'll let you decide which, or try to let you decide which you're more interested in and less interested in, because there's a few too many. This is what got me started on this topic is actually David Elmer's book, which I think you might have had an open house with him. Very nice book on the politics of consent. Or consensus, I think, in the Iliad. And as some of you may know, he talks about these very passages where Zeus has conflicts with the other gods, and the verb epainein, and when Athena says, we will not approve you, Zeus, and that's a very hard thing for Zeus to hear, and he backs off. And David compares that to the political debates of the Trojans and the Greeks as well, and where consensus rules. I take a different look at those things, but he drew my attention to the passages because when I read his book, and I of course knew them, but I also looked at them from my studies in comedy, and people have noticed that Zeus is a really unusual character in the Iliad. He has a secret. He has a secret that everybody knows, but he's trying to keep it anyway. So he has a plan, and people are trying to frustrate it and find out more about it. He's in charge of a lot of people, but they're very powerful people and willful and opinionated people, and they tend to resist him. He asserts himself as he can assert himself quite often and behave very violently, but he only threatens that in the Iliad. And he's in conflict with Moira, or with fate of some way, when in the deaths of Sarpedon and Hector. And so he doesn't really get what he wants at the end, and he's working for other people, so that the boule of Zeus, you could say, is a very ironic statement from Zeus's point of view at the beginning of the Iliad. And it's also been pointed out several times that he's one of the most reflective characters in the Iliad. He speaks his feelings. He doesn't calculate his words. And that happens even in the Odyssey at the opening. He tells us things directly. And that makes him really a fascinating character in his own right, but he was also for later writers, especially of comedy with a big C, capital C, or comedy with a small c. And I wanted to, let's see, I guess the questions I'm interested in discussing today are, to what extent, because you all are Iliad aficionados, more than I am, probably, and I'm interested in your disagreement or comments. To what extent do the texts we've been looking at look back to the Iliad, or are they maybe distortions of the Iliad? And how do they serve their own purposes? And is there anything, since they're all comedy, is there anything serious underlying them? Are there really serious points being made here? And so with this could work, this kind of approach could work for one or all of the comic instances I've given you. So as again, we'll see how much time we have for what there is. I also wanted to say, and I did give a talk on this a number of years ago at the SCS meeting, and those slides from that are available on academia.com. But my thinking has developed somewhat since then. And I've also come to realize that a big part of the role of Zeus is from Hesiod in the tradition as well. And so Zeus, after his appearance in the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey, gets a lot of adulation and flattering depiction by Hesiod, especially in the Theogony. At least I would call that flattering. I know Philippe Rousseau, a friend of mine, has thought intensely about the portrait of Zeus in the Theogony, and thinks it's a very dramatic series of events that show Zeus as a dynamic empire builder who's to be admired. But then the people flatter and admire him in other ways. The statue of Zeus at Olympia, the one by Phidias made of gold and ivory, was far more important than the similar statue of Athena that he made for the Parthenon. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it's depicted on many coins, and it's considered the image of a divinity par excellence in the ancient Greek world throughout until the Roman period. And you could go and look at Zeus's face. You could, since he was seated, you could go up on the balcony if you were a tourist at Olympia, and you could look right into his eyes, and ancient writers say that was quite an experience. But then the Stoics especially praised Zeus as the god who took thought for everything in advance. He had pronoia. He was the one who looked out for us. And the Stoic Cleanthes wrote a hymn to Zeus, and Aratus in the Phenomena started out with a hymn to Zeus. So he got a lot of praise. So if you're going to hear all of these ridiculous things that he's made to do in comedy, keep remembering that it wasn't the only picture of him throughout this period. So we're and each of these comic things is quite different from each other in the sort of comedy they do and the way they portray him and the way they use him. Sometimes he's very important. Sometimes he's key but not central to a story. And sometimes he's used in very predictable ways, and sometimes in a surprising way, I think. The text I wanted to look at then, the first one, and I'll just say what they are first, or the texts or images. Cratinus. I haven't given you any Cratinus to read because it's fragmentary and quite difficult to interpret. And pretty much the book that this book is what what I'm drawing on. And I did not make, these are translations of all the fragments, or not all, but the most important or the most interesting fragments of ancient comedy. And I did not do this myself. I had help from 4 very well-known scholars, Jeff Henderson, Ralph Rosen, Niall Slater, and David Constan. But I edited it, and I'm the one responsible for delaying it for 15 years. Because they had done their part already. And one of the reasons it got delayed is because I realized that these images were a crucial part of the comic dossier and had to be collected in their own right, even though they were not collected before. So a selection of them took quite a while to add to the book. In this book, it's translations only. It's not meant for specialists. It's meant for people looking at comic fragments for the first time. And I can just give you a real quick blurb for it. I argue that comic fragments are much more important than fragments of epic or tragedy, for example, because there's more of them, and we only have one major comic author, from old comedy at least. And we have substantial fragments about the other plays of other authors. So probably the 2 most famous plays in the ancient world, Eupolis Deems, which brought back politicians from the dead to help Athens at a crucial time, and is the basis for the plot of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, if you know that film. And then Eupolis Deems, and then the other one is Cratinus Wine Jug, the wine flask, in which he was the major character. He played himself, and he was a drunk who had to have an intervention, and so that he could sober himself up. Unfortunately, when he sobered himself up, he couldn't write anymore, so he relapsed at the end of the comedy, as far as we can tell. So you can see with plays like that, it's worth studying the fragments, and there are all, and among them is Cratinus's play called the Nemesis, which has Zeus as its main character, as far as we can tell. Among the Nemesis was in some versions the mother of Helen, and so Zeus had sex with her in the form of a bird. I forget which bird. Maybe she's the swan. Yeah, that must be. It's an alternative version of Leda. It must be the swan. And in this play, he treated Zeus as a tyrant, and he kept calling him a tyrant and saying things about him that were curiously reminiscent of Pericles. In one fragment, he says, "Here comes onion-headed Zeus," and Pericles was famous for his misshapen head, and he says the famous one, which, and the word for extremely famous is perikleis, because Pericles is an adjective, and he says now that the vote on ostracism is over. So in other words, there was Zeus walking on stage, but everything said about him, even the adjective used to describe him, was clearly about Pericles. And Aspasia, Pericles' wife, is an adjective also, and it means welcome or gladly received or something like that. And he used that in connection with Hera in the same play. But so we know from other sources that Pericles was a bête noire of Cratinus, but he wrote one play called the Plutuses, the Plutoi, the gods of wealth, which must have been after Pericles' death, because it starts out, of which we have a fragmentary beginning, but enough to tell what the gods of wealth were saying. He pluralized many of these divinities, and so instead of one Plutus, there's a lot of them, and they're the chorus. And they say that now the tyrant has died, and now we gods of wealth can come back from our imprisonment and take over the world again. And by the tyrant, he clearly means Pericles. And what he's doing is actually capitalizing on the death of Pericles during the Peloponnesian War of the plague, presumably, and arguing that it's the beginning of a new golden age. So that's pretty negative. In other words, pretty negative about Pericles and about Zeus. Right? So that's all we know, but it's quite harsh, and shows us that Aristophanes wasn't the first person to write about Zeus. But Aristophanes plays, and I don't know, there is a group of Cosmos reading Aristophanes Plutus, I think. At least it's on your webpage. I don't know if any of you is aware of that or how that happened. I heartily approve of that decision, because it's a very neglected play, and it's to a great extent, like 3 other plays, it's about Zeus in a very curious way. Because whenever I say I'm going to talk about Zeus and Aristophanes, they scratch their heads and say, wait, Zeus and Aristophanes, he isn't in any of the plays of Aristophanes. And I say, exactly. Exactly. But in 3 plays, he sends messengers. In 3 plays, he's the bad guy. And the least bad guy, he is in The Birds, where he sends his brother Poseidon and Heracles and the Tribalian at the end to negotiate surrender to the birds. And in other words, he simply wants to be rid of this threat. Then in the piece, a man, Trygaius, an Athenian farmer, goes to heaven on a dung beetle, which is very funny. Look up dung beetles flying up sometime on YouTube. It's very funny the way they fly. And Aristophanes had him do that and go to see Zeus and ask for peace during the Peloponnesian War, but Zeus had left Olympus. He was so disgusted by the war that he just decided to absent himself and leave, and he locked up peace and left only war behind in the palace of the gods. And all Trygaius could find was Hermes left behind to tell him the story. Hermes always does Zeus's dirty work in comedy. He's his servant. So that there, a problem that Zeus made has to be solved. And in the piece, in the Plutus, the final play, the god Wealth, same deity as in Cratinus, but now just one god, Wealth, is blind, and so can't. This was in the fragments or the selections I gave you some of. So we discover that Athens is in economic crisis, and the lead character goes to an oracle to find the solution. He wants his son to take up a life of crime, and instead the oracle says, join the first man you see as you leave this shrine, and make common cause with him, or the first person you see. And that turns out to be a blind man who turns out to be the god of wealth, who has been blinded by Zeus. And so the play is mainly about this very odd plot to heal wealth at the shrine of Asclepius, which they do. And then once he can see again, wealth goes to the people that it should go to, namely the good people. And the farmer, his name escapes me, you probably remember it and I don't. The farmer brings them all to his house and brings wealth to his house, installs him as the new god of Athens, and Zeus is ousted. You read at the end of the play, you notice Hermes comes down and says, Zeus seems to be out completely, and I'm not getting any love or any sacrifices. Can I join you guys? And even the priest of Zeus joins them at the end. So again, Zeus does not appear, but he's certainly a big factor in the play. And as a matter of fact, the book has just come out with a translation of these 3 plays. I forget. I can give you the reference if you want. I forget the translator's name. But his thesis is that Aristophanes was a radical atheist, like Richard Dawkins or something like that. that he was trying to show people in these three plays that the gods were bad for them and they should adopt atheism. That seems a stretch to me. I think Zeus is well, I don't know what you think. Zeus as a character, can you see what kind of a character he might be in these plays compared with the tyrant of Crotinus? I don't know. That's one thing. If you didn't want to answer now, I might like you to think about that. What sort of person is it who never appears on stage and yet wants to pull all the strings, but is actually malevolent towards humans? And where does that come from in the tradition about Zeus? Or maybe it's a rebellion against it.
I think.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jeffrey. I'm thinking it comes from Aeschylus's Prometheus.
Oh, right, right. That's a great point.
There's several echoes, I think, talking about the tyranness of Zeus.
Right.
The very beginning, the prologue of the Prometheus talks about how grievous it is to stumble against the tyranness of Zeus, and talking about, and of course Prometheus is being punished for helping humans, giving fire to the humans, and here they keep talking about you got to watch out to not offend Zeus in the style of Prometheus. There's mention of the Titans too, just sort of like, I think, echoes. So I took it as a bit of a parody of Aeschylus's Zeus.
That's right.
I'm taking.
Yeah, that's great, and that would account for both Crotinus, nasty tyrant, and the misanthrope of Aristophanes. He unites those two things. He's capable of great violence against his enemies, and he also, in general, has it in for humanity and dislikes anybody who helps them. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Oh, please, yeah, if you could, somebody else want to speak? Yeah. Oh, you're muted still, I'm afraid. There we go.
There you go. Oh, somehow, Maria, we still can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm afraid.
Oh, unfortunately. Maybe you can type them into the... Oh, I think Maria's going to leave and come back in. Okay.
I'll wait for that, but I'll just expanding on the Prometheus comment, that's a great idea, because Zeus is certainly absent in that play, and he sends Hermes to do his dirty work for him again, right? And Lucian has a funny take on that whole situation we might talk about. He turns that into comedy too, his version of Zeus. But
reading that.
That's a very central point that I shouldn't have skipped over, the Prometheus bound. Although chronologically I don't know exactly where it fits, but it's a very strong portrayal. Yeah.
So I was wondering when I was thinking about, I'm probably more familiar with the Iliad than I am with the later dramas and so forth, but I wondered if there might be something in the idea of democracy as opposed to, you mentioned Pericles as a tyrant, or Zeus as some sort of tyrant. I mean, he doesn't exactly sit around and make democratic decisions, even though we hear his thought processes. And as a sort of he wants to be at least a powerful ruler, and perhaps that was a little distasteful to the ideals of Athenian democracy. Is that perhaps one reason that we see them poking fun at him?
Yeah, well, yeah, the combination with democracy is especially interesting, because you would figure that in a democracy, that would be the one place where you couldn't possibly have a tyrant. That's what democracy is set up to avoid. And yet Pericles seems to have flourished in a democracy. But Crotinus, well, of course, one thing a democracy fears most is a potential tyrant. So Crotinus that's a good charge to level against Pericles if he wants to frighten people. And yet it's hard to point to anything tyrannic that Pericles has actually done in the historical record, except be the sole survivor of the Athenian politicians of his day. But Cratinus is totally unambiguous. Pericles is just in every way, and he's Zeus. He's not just a tyrant. He's Zeus, because later on, of course, Alcibiades, later on, the charge of somebody being a tyrant was the standard one you'd say against your enemy. But you'd never equate that person with Zeus. Oh, yes, Maria, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to pick up Jack's point, and I was wondering, because there are many people who believe that that Prometheus Vinctus is may not be attributed to Aeschylus, and some people say that it might be written around 430 BCE. So could we just attribute this defiance, this questioning of Zeus as the almighty god, the god of heroes and gods, the way he is represented in the Iliad, as a kind of belonging, to the milieu to this era, because some people also say that the Derveni papyrus text became from this era. So maybe this came from all this era of questioning. I wouldn't call it defiance. I wouldn't even, because these are terms that we use them nowadays. So just an idea.
So you wouldn't call it defiance, but you'd just call it questioning. Or did I missed a little bit of your statement?
Yes. I call it questioning. Well, it depends on the argument, how we articulate the argument of defiance.
Right. Well, I guess if you set out to tell the story of Prometheus, then you almost certainly have to run up against Zeus. That's inherent in the story, although not perhaps quite as strongly as the author of the Prometheus Bound does. So I think most people now would think that it's post-Aeschylean, and there are arguments in favor of that from the meter. The meter is not much like other Aeschylean plays, but people do have the idea that Aeschylus seems unlikely to have presented Zeus quite that way from his other plays. So it would suit a sophist period. Yeah.
Yeah. So the scope of my word, probably Aristophanes may be aligned with also Prometheus Vinctus's main point that Zeus is not how he's represented. He's not the almighty God, quite the opposite. Right. Not focus on what I call questioning or defiance, but maybe let's focus on how Aristophanes wants to present Zeus.
Right.
Yes?
And that's actually something that comedy does quite often, which is to take a fearsome tyrant and turn him into an inept tyrant. And so, like Charlie Chaplin did with Hitler in The Great Dictator, and you mock him, certainly that's something we later see for Zeus. And Aristophanes does a little bit of it. In the Birds, he has Prometheus appear. But this Prometheus is bringing secrets from the gods. He tells the secret plans of the gods. He's like Edward Snowden for the gods.
Exactly.
And he gives away all their plans because he really wants to help the humans. So it's still, the hostility is still there, but now Zeus is totally powerless to do anything about it. And Prometheus can ally with humans and win. So that it's not that different in some ways than Prometheus Bound, now that I think about it. That's an important point, yeah. So I don't know if other people had things they wanted to add to that and on Aristophanes. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much.
Oh, hi.
Yes, hello, thank you. Now, I would like to say something to the almighty part that we were talking about. And yeah, it is kind of strange and contradictory because, you know, in the Iliad, starting from the Iliad, we have this image of Zeus being the almighty, the tyrant, everybody is afraid. He has the first and last word. But at the end of the day, these two passages you shared with us, Sarpedon and Hector, where he really expresses, he's being reflective, as you mentioned, he expresses his wish and his emotions there is actually to save both or not to let these atrocities happen, how he feels. And he doesn't have his way. And in this both occasions, Hera and Athena step in and remind him that he cannot do that. He could. It's not about not having the power, but within, you know, the, let's say, the caucus of the assembly of the gods, you know, the group of gods would not have him have his way, which is it's an amazing idea in the Iliad, starting there. And I mean, even Athena, when she tries to pull back Ares, who's completely enraged and wants to pull his horses and go back, defying Zeus, she restrains him by saying, you know, if you do that, he will come back and he will punish everybody, regardless who is responsible or not, Aetius. You know? And this is the theme which recurs in Aristophanes too. Why should on earth wealth go to everybody and not be blinded and go everybody and not go to the just people or to the ones who deserve it? So there are these recurring themes for the human beings. You know, the boule d'os is a wide topic and discuss. You know, in which sphere, you know, Zeus is not able to fulfill, or let's say to have his way, because in the epic he cannot have his way. You know, the normal is not to have his way because otherwise the story does not exist anymore. You know. And this is alone. So, so for the humans, you know, these narratives cannot exist. I mean, it's the intellect and the emotional sphere there are in great conflicts, and this is where comedy comes. You cannot, I don't know, defiant is I would say a big, strong word, but it's there a legitimate reproach to things that do not make sense. Let's say intuitively. And this is, I think, where you know, they just step in. And as I remember, and I think many of you perhaps know, you know, for example, sometimes other people's, you know, writings, appreciations in, you know, in the meta literature level, you know, how they interpret, you know, the ancient Greek literature. Sometimes that might be a guideline. Kavafis, you know, the modern Greek poet, has a poem on Sarpedon. And what he says in Greek is, and I will translate freely, that actually Zeus let, you know, the sun, you know, have this fate because nomos, that's actually the word he uses, had to be this way. So this is how it's not about not granting Zeus these great powers. He was almighty, but did it help him? No. And this is where the humans step in to, you know, assess why do we have this and why do we need, let's say, this meta reflection. Sorry, I don't want to take more.
Oh no, that's great. That's great. I mean, the point you raised also shows that there are several different ways to interpret this difficulty that Zeus has, and one of them is definitely, as you said, that Zeus actually makes a profound decision. I think that's one of the things you were saying. Zeus makes a profound decision to let these things happen because that's for the overall good. And others, and actually David Elmer makes a good point that it's what fate is going to be turns out to be the story that we all know already. And so to some extent you could view fate as the reader's foreknowledge of the end of the story. And so the poet is actually functioning or putting fate in his place. So, and then as you point out in comedy, yes, comedy can change that story. They can change that story anytime they like. Or they can undermine it. They can say, well, that's technically what happened, but it wasn't really that way. So all of those are present, I think. That's really very nice. Thank you. Um, so I didn't want to cut off anybody, but I did. I want to say something about the vases too, because I may have spent too much. I may spend too much time. Oh, I also want to say that once we get to Lucian, I have a difficulty. Lucian is at the end chronologically, but also for a good reason, because once we get to Lucian, it's very difficult for me not to laugh at Zeus anymore, to take Zeus seriously after I've seen Lucian's take on him. It's difficult to return to the Zeus of the Iliad with quite the same spirit. So maybe we'll save Lucian for later. But the vases, let's see. I just wanted to show you a few vases that show Zeus in comedy after Aristophanes. And I don't know, Keith, if it's possible to put up those, the slideshow. And can I still speak while you're putting up the slideshow?
Yes.
The one I'd especially like to show you is the one where he's holding a ladder. Yeah, if you could move ahead to the one where he's holding a ladder to the window. This is actually, while you have this up, this is a vase that I could talk about all day, but I won't. Aristophanes was alive when this vase was printed, was painted, and it shows a mask of Zeus, and it's now in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And this is the one I wanted to show you. Here you see a man dressed in silly comic costume with a padded suit on and an ugly mask. And notice he's wearing a crown on his head. That's very significant because Cratinus already alluded to the fact that whenever Zeus was portrayed in comedy, he would have a little crown like this. And he's carrying a ladder to the window, obviously to climb up and seduce this woman who's looking down. And now I'm saying that's Zeus, and other people would say, how can you say that's Zeus? Well, it seems to me because Zeus doesn't need to climb up a ladder in a window, right, to seduce a woman. But it seems to me, what's the absolute proof that this is Zeus in the other character in the scene?
That's Hermes, right?
It's got to be Hermes, right?
Sidekick.
Is this some other king hanging out with Hermes? I mean, it's absolute. The identification with Zeus is absolutely beyond question, I think. And there are other scenes that show a normal man and a normal sidekick doing this same thing. But in this case, at least a vase painter could imagine that Zeus was doing it. I should mention that this is from the later 4th century BC. This is not from Athens, or it's from southern Italy, from around Paestum. And you can see the style is quite different from the normal Athenian vase painting style. And yet these scenes, unlike the Athenian paintings of comedy, actually give us scenes from a play. They don't tell us the author and they don't tell us the name of the play, but there's about 50 of these, which really deserve to be published separately. Oliver Taplin wrote a very nice book called Comic Angels about them, but his illustrations aren't in color, and he doesn't really put them all together. So I've done just a selection of them in the Birth of Comedy book, but they're not in color either. I have color photos of all these, and they're quite interesting. But anyway, here's Zeus. And the thing about this picture is, if you'll look at Zeus's face, you see he has a hooked nose, he's got a high brow, and he's got a kind of, he's an older man, obviously. He's got a pointed beard and a pointed chin, and a little crown on his head. This is the next slide. Here you see the same man with a crown on his head and the same comic costume with the dangling phallus. And he's got this pointed nose and this long beard on his chin, scraggly beard on his chin, and the furrows in his forehead. And now, in addition, notice what he's carrying. You notice it's an eagle, right? So there's not much doubt about who he is, even though the other man is not necessarily Hermes. So this is Zeus approaching somebody from behind and about to grab that person or greet that person. And evidently this is total speculation, but it looks to me like this person is dressed as a woman, but is in fact an ugly man, the one with his back to him. And if you know the opera Don Giovanni, in the opening scenes of Don Giovanni, who is just like Zeus. I mean, he jumps on every woman he sees, right? And he's impossible, and he has Leporello as his sidekick, just like Hermes. Don Giovanni approaches a woman from behind to start to try to seduce her and doesn't realize that it's one of his ex-girlfriends who hates him. And she turns around and screams at him. So this isn't quite the same surprise, but it's a very similar scene, I think, with Zeus and his helper. And his helper sees who this is, as Leporello does in the opera, but Zeus does not. He's going to get quite a surprise. But as I said, these are all speculation. We don't really know. But you see again the same face, right? The same mask. And if you go back now to the first slide, very first one. Yeah, that's it. So this is an Athenian vase. This is not a Southern Italian vase. And it's the oldest comic vase there is. And it's from Athens, even though it was found in the Crimea. It was painted in Athens. It's a very tiny vase. It was found in a very wealthy tomb in the Crimea. And it's got added gold. You see the headbands of the boys there, and the wristband. Those are actually of gold. And so this was a luxury item, even though it showed a vulgar, obscene comic costume. Except they're not even in complete costume. They're half dressed. These boys. This is probably something that commemorated a victory in a comic competition in Athens. There's a famous vase called the Pronamos vase, which shows boys dressed as satyrs that probably commemorates a tragic victory. And here you have something similar for comedy. But the masks that interests me is the second one, the one on your left, the top one.
That's being held in the left hand of one of the boys, right?
Yeah, it's the first boy on the left, that one, right. The one with the big rounded nose and the wispy beard and the long face and the little tiny crown on top of his head. Right? So this is the only mask I know of where we can actually identify the character. I'm pretty sure this is what Zeus looked like on the stage. And it's not very flattering, obviously. So in what's called middle comedy, the comedy after Aristophanes, Zeus seems to be the butt of jokes as a playboy who can't keep his fly unzipped, and he gets in trouble. He gets in trouble for that in Lucian as well. Although I can't resist adding, he has a conversation in Lucian with Hera, and she says, all right, I'm used to all your girlfriends, all your seductions, because they all stay down on Earth. But Ganymede, come on, that is the last straw. I don't want this boy at dinner with me every night for all eternity. And Zeus says, oh, it's completely platonic. So he doesn't actually say platonic, but that's what he implies. So, anyway, with that, I maybe should move to Lucian quickly because time is running. Lucian is an author that I heartily recommend. It's funny. It took me a long time to come to him because Lucian floats in classical literature. He doesn't seem to be anchored anywhere. He doesn't seem to have a historical context or a literary tradition. He just is treated as a one-time phenomenon and who's only out for entertainment. And he is all those things, but he's also like some other writers of the Roman period. Some of you may know the second greatest period, or maybe, you would say Homer is a great period of Greek literature. The 5th century is a great period of Greek literature. After that, I'm firmly convinced that the 2nd century of the Roman Empire was almost equally great for Greek literature. That's the 8th century that produces Plutarch and Lucian, and at the end of it, Philostratus. And really, this is an age when there's much more great Greek literature in the Roman Empire than there is Latin. And Lucian is right in the thick of that. And he doesn't write about himself very much, but he does do something that he tells us about, which is quite unique. He says, I am picking up old comedy. He says, I am fusing old comedy with dialogue and writing for the reader, but still doing old comedy. And one of my students once said he liked to imagine Lucian as writing for the radio. That Lucian's works would do best as radio plays. And he wrote a nice paper comparing Icaro to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, if you've ever heard of that radio show. So Lucian has a trilogy about Zeus. Zeus is by far Lucian's favorite character, and he writes about him in kind of in a sequence. And I gave you Icaro, which is the end of the sequence. But I did want to mention there's a work called Zeus Refuted, Zeus Elenkomenos, in which a cynic philosopher grills Zeus about his relationship to fate, and convinces Zeus that he in fact has no power. And he has a great argument. He says, okay, and Zeus says, yes, of course the fates are responsible for everything. Or Moirai, the Moirai. And then he goes on, he says, what about Hamar, Mene, and Tuke? Are they Moirai? And Zeus says, well, no, but I think we should stop talking now. And he goes on and he says, well, why do we sacrifice to gods instead of to the Moirai? And Zeus says, well, I don't know. And he said, wait a minute, why do we even sacrifice to the Moirai if they can't change anything themselves either? Why do we sacrifice to any of you? And Zeus says, well, it's just because we're superior beings. And the cynic says, oh, superior? What? How did you treat your father? Was that superior? How did you treat Prometheus? Was that superior? And Zeus is getting more and more upset, and he threatens to hurt him. He threatens to blast him, and he says, well, you can't blast me unless it's fated that you blast me, right? And Zeus finally just cuts off the whole conversation, and the cynic says, well, I guess it just wasn't fated that I would learn any more today. But in the next work, Zeus is a character who is capable of listening to what you say and actually being affected by it in the Iliad. And here he is too. Zeus, after this conversation, completely panics and goes back to the gods and calls an emergency meeting to decide what they should do about it, because humans are going to stop worshiping them. But the gods, of course, the gods are about as unified on this as, the United States Congress would be. And they all squabble with each other and start trash talking with each other because they're full, just like in the Iliad, they're full of their own jealousies and their own partisanships. But then the final play, the final work in his trilogy is the Icaro, which you did read a little bit of, right? I think, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so that's a very poignant picture of Zeus to me. I don't know what your thoughts was in the little bit of time we have left about that, but how did you think of Zeus here as a character? And did you find any links with any of the previous portraits?
I thought of the birds, with the birds were and back to the Iliad. There's a germ in the Iliad of Zeus being venal, caring about the look at all the hecatombs that the Trojans have burned for me. And then in the birds, the birds were going to create this blockade of heaven, so the smoke won't come up to heaven. It's maybe it's just me, but I think that there's the gods are being treated as greedy. They're not they're not selfless. Altruistic, human-loving gods that we have in other traditions that love us. And Aristophanes, both in the in Plutus and the Icaro that you directed our attention to, I think build on that and use it as tools for humor.
Mhm. Right.
I got a kick out of it anyway, looking at it that way.
And he is very concerned. Well, he's somewhat concerned here with the lack of human interest in him, because you notice he has a human finally visit him, and so he says, why don't the Athenians hold their festival for me anymore? And when are they going to finish that temple of Zeus anyway? He's really follows this all, and he's kind of sad about it, right? And he quotes Aratus. He sings the beginning of the Phenomena. I said, now that was a good poem. That was great. Those were the days. So I think Lucian can add something that the writers of the Second Sophistic do add. Plutarch adds this in some dialogues. And one of them is, these gods are, 700 years older than they were the last time we saw them. And have they really not changed? Are things really the same? Can we still feel about them the same way that we did when we read the Iliad, when it was fresh, and when we didn't have so much history between us? And Lucian never alludes to this directly, and he even sets it in the Hellenistic period. Menippus is a Hellenistic character, not a Roman period character, but yet there's still this sense that you have in Plutarch's work on the Decline of Oracles, which is a very poignant work. People assembled at Delphi saying, why don't these oracles matter anymore? Why don't they matter? And Plutarch says, or one of Plutarch's characters says, it's because the gods have pretty much retired, and they have daimones that work for them and carry on their traditions. But the direct contact with the gods, this one character says, has disappeared. And there's a little bit of that in Icaro too. I mean, he has his little tubes that keep him in touch with mortal prayers. But he's very distant now. And then Icaro says, how come Apollo still doesn't have a beard after 700 years? Huh? And so things like that. It's definitely comic, but can you see it might have a serious side?
I wonder if you would say, Jeff, that the passages you gave us from the Iliad are comic themselves, whether precursors or something like, well, we've talked about in our own group and the Heroes course how epic incorporates other genres like lament. Mm-hmm. And I don't know the history of comedy at all, I'll say, but is it possible that these passages are incorporating some kind of comic genre or proto-comic genre? They're kind of making fun of Zeus.
Well, people like me who work on comedy tend to be a little disrespectful sometimes to these scenes, because we already see, somebody who takes the Iliad seriously, and it's a very serious poem, does not really want to see Zeus of the Iliad as a sitcom dad with an unruly family. It would be, The Modern Family, if you've ever watched that show, or something like that, where the tyrannical father never really gets his way, or has to back down. So that's maybe a little too far, but the comic potential is certainly there. The comic potential is there, and some people have called the gods just the comic relief from the humans. Again, I think that probably goes too far, but because there are profound issues that they're working on and that they're illustrating. So I hesitate. Yeah, I'm kind of ambiguous about that. I think that very early on people saw the comic potential in continuing the characters of the Iliad, Lucian especially.
And Jeff, I think, to pick up on your question about the seriousness in the comedy, both Lucian and Aristophanes really do get to, they make a lot of fun of how people are getting away with injustice, and how it almost seems like you have to do injustice, be unjust or a crook or somehow corrupt to be successful in the world.
Right.
And so it really it's almost like aversion therapy. You get so much of this by Plutus being blind or by other devices. You have this desire for justice and for wealth distribution to be fair and just, not for the corrupt to accumulate the wealth and the good people to be kicked around.
Yeah, and that you go to the top. If you have a complaint, you go to the top and you figure out who's responsible, and there's nobody but Zeus you can go to. And so he foots the blame. He bears the blame in almost every case. Yeah. And there is a little bit, by the way, there's also a little bit of the evil prospering. Zeus, you may notice at the end of Icaro says, well, I'm gonna blast those philosophers with a thunderbolt. And he's constantly saying that, and he never gets around to it. And he said, well, there's a festival now, I can't do it until next spring. So he has these good intentions, but he loses focus.
Well, we have to wrap up about now.
Yeah.
Is there maybe one more question from someone who hasn't asked a question yet? Well, I'll take that as a no. Georgia, I saw that you wanted to.
Yeah,
Do
please.
something quick.
No, just shortly, I want to say, because you mentioned before, you asked about the development through the ages, because obviously we have this time gap between the Iliad and Lucian. And actually, in his word, Zeus, by holding the assembly, he starts by even using the phrase of Homer, but then telling about, in a way, the development, historical development. Obviously, all philosophers appear, and then he names the different, schools. But in a way, it's there. The historical moment is there. The evolution is there, and it's. I cannot not see it as an allusion, to what is happening and how the human should, regard these things. And he actually finishes. He concludes. This is the last words. The assembly. Let's conclude, and then have the things which are most useful for the humans and more safe as phalestata for the gods. Because at the end, what do? If you want to preserve it, you have to keep a face.
You have to protect ourselves, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I really, just because you asked it before, so about whether it's there. And
Zeus himself sees the process, yeah. Although he's only panicked just recently. He panics quite quickly. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for joining us for this.
Oh, my pleasure.
Talk about Kali. Really appreciated it. And we've been talking a little bit already about perhaps getting you again to talk to us about Thucydides, maybe in the spring.
I'd love to. You can. I'll go on forever, though. Well, it's good you limit me to an hour. For Thucydides, I go on too. So sorry in advance for that. But I love to talk with you. Thank you so much. It's such a great group and such a great idea. And glad to hear all of you doing.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Thank you, Keith, Sarah, Ellen, all of you. Thanks.